Now we're going to return you to our nation's capital, where we just got a big ruling in where the Supreme Court just released a decision on President Trump's tariff authority.
Yeah, this is breaking news. In their decision, they ruled against using Emergency Powers Act to impose tariffs, which undercuts the very foundation of the president's economic plans. You know, we have really followed this story since the very beginning, especially because there's a Vernon Hills company called Hand to Mind. They have learning resources for young children. We've spoken with the owners of that company repeatedly, as this has really bounced around in the court system for quite some time here. And, you know, what they look at is the fact that these tariffs would essentially put them out of business, that the added cost to do business would put small businesses out of commission, essentially. You heard the governor talk about it in his State of the State address just this week, speaking about that very aspect of the small businesses.
Hi, everyone. It's John. Thanks for coming back. The Supreme Court delivered a devastating 1-2 punch, stripping Trump of his immunity and emergency powers defenses while blocking Republican gerrymandering schemes in multiple states. The rulings have sent GOP lawmakers into panic, as every legal and electoral strategy they relied on is collapsing at once. On the redistricting front, the blocking of GOP maps in Texas and other states represents federal courts finally taking a hard line against extreme partisan gerrymandering. We've discussed the Texas case before, but the significance is even greater now because courts in multiple states are following similar logic to block Republican gerrymanders. This isn't just one state. This is a pattern of judicial intervention that's going to force fairer maps across the country. And fairer maps mean more competitive districts.
I could tell you that just this week I also spoke with the founder of agnet.com.
Okay.
And he is a 7th generation farmer in central Illinois, and he talked about it. You know, obviously they look at it from a very different perspective, but if you think about the crops that they're harvesting, the imports, the exports, from that standpoint, you know, also talking about, I mean, he said this was one of the biggest issues that he has had to face in his time now running his family's company. And I asked him, like, okay, 7 generations, look at what those who came before you had to deal with. Was this the worst? And he was like, without a doubt, this has been one of the trickiest situations for them.
All right, we have our expert on the line, Ross Mack, economist, is going to join us now. Ross, first, let's start with, what is your reaction to this big-time decision by the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, I was trying to actually see exactly what happened. I was watching CNBC, and I know they were saying, you know, it's 170-page.
Which means Republicans lose the built-in structural advantages they've been relying on to maintain power, even when they lose the popular vote. The immediate impact for the upcoming elections is that dozens of seats that Republicans thought were safely gerrymandered are now potentially competitive. That dramatically changes the electoral landscape and forces Republicans to defend seats they thought were secure. The visible chaos of Republican lawmakers fleeing the Capitol tells you how devastating they know these rulings are. Politicians don't panic and flee buildings unless they believe they're facing an existential crisis. The emergency meetings that immediately convened show Republicans desperately trying to figure out what these rulings mean for their legal strategies, for their electoral strategies, for their ability to protect Trump.
Page document, and therefore they actually got to go through it kind of line by line. But right now I'm actually trying to see, I think, you know, when it's all said and done, it's like it can potentially have adverse impact on the market. But I think, you know, if the Supreme Court is to uphold it, I think that, you know, it's a function of how difficult is it to contain inflation, right? I think this is a function of who actually takes on these price hikes. Is it the foreign producers or is it the end consumer here? And I think, you know, so far we've been seeing inflation be extremely persistent. And as a result, the American consumer actually has been really bold, you know, holding that cost. And, you know, as we all understand, the cost of living has been extremely high as of recent.
Yeah, it's so hard because businesses can only boost their prices to offset that so much. when you have people who are already feeling cash strapped. Ross, over the last few days, even yesterday, the stock market.
But there are no good answers. The Supreme Court has closed off the legal escape routes. The redistricting decisions have removed electoral safeguards. Republicans are facing a situation where Trump is going to face prosecution without immunity defenses, where they're going to face elections on less favorable maps, where all their carefully constructed strategies for maintaining power are collapsing. The court's statement that future executive action must run through Congress, not the White House, is a fundamental reassertion of legislative authority.
Was read all day. The last few days ahead of that, we saw some volatility there. But look, right now on your screen, we're showing, there was some green popped up here. How do you think the day is going to play out?
Well, I think it's important that we understand everything is relative. If you look at the stock market, it's still extremely it's been doing extremely well, right? I think, and this really bodes to the fact that we're in a K-shaped economy, right? Where the people that own assets are doing well, where the people that don't are actually feeling the true impact of higher inflation, right? As you showed Dow Jones just crept over 50,000, which was monumental. And as you can see, it's not far off. And so I think that the stock market has obviously been extremely resilient, right? I think the first time we talked about these tariffs and Liberation Day was a year ago, and that's when we first saw the pain. And since then, the market has truly just shrugged it off. And so I think to anybody that's an investor.
For years, presidents of both parties have been acting unilaterally more and more, using executive orders and emergency declarations to make policy without getting congressional approval. The court is now saying that trend has to reverse, that major policy decisions require congressional approval, that presidents can't just declare emergencies and govern by fiat. This is constitutionally correct. The founders designed a system where Congress makes laws and presidents execute them, not where presidents make laws through emergency declarations. But it's also politically devastating for Trump and for future Republican presidents, who've relied on unilateral executive action to implement policies they couldn't get through Congress. The description that Trump's last legal safety nets are gone captures the severity of his position.
Don't, look at a day like today in a microcosm and say, oh, now let me be risk off. I think, everybody should always remain long term because the market already has digested and said we are able to live with tariffs. Now, in the event the Supreme Court is to reverse it, that could very well be good in the short term for the stock market. But nonetheless, we got to look at this on a long-term standpoint. And then you could actually say which sectors are going to do well. And I think that's the one thing that might change. But I think in terms of dollars that's been on the sideline, the stock market, once again, all of the indices are near all-time highs, right? And now if we're saying which sectors may do better than the others, now we're talking about companies who assemble their products, whether it's in China or India, et cetera, whether it's autos, whether it's, devices, electronic devices, phones, computers, et cetera, that might, we might actually see some of those prices come down for the end consumer. But when it's all said and done, I always implore people, be a long-term investor and don't even look at it.
Ross, I want to make sure here that we have been led to believe that the Supreme Court has indeed reversed the decision on tariffs. Are you hearing something different from that?
Trump has been using every possible legal maneuver to delay prosecutions, to claim immunity, to argue for special treatment. But the Supreme Court has now systematically rejected all of those arguments. There are no more appeals to make about immunity. There are no more delay tactics based on emergency powers. The legal process can now proceed quickly toward trials and potential convictions because Trump has run out of procedural ways to obstruct it. That's why his allies are panicking. They can see that accountability is actually going to happen, and there's no way to stop it anymore. So why does this matter beyond just Trump's legal troubles and Republican electoral problems? Because these rulings represent the Supreme Court enforcing constitutional structures that have been eroding for decades. The restoration of congressional power, the limits on emergency authority, the rejection of extreme gerrymandering. These are all moves that strengthen democratic accountability and check authoritarian tendencies. If the court had ruled the other way, allowing presidents to act unilaterally, allowing immunity from prosecution, allowing unlimited gerrymandering, it would have represented democracy sliding toward authoritarianism. Instead, the court is pulling the system back toward constitutional norms and democratic accountability. That's significant for the long-term health of American democracy, regardless of how it affects any individual politician or party. Now, let's dig into the specific legal reasoning in these Supreme Court rulings and understand exactly what they mean for presidential power, for redistricting, and for the future of American governance. Because the details of what the court actually said reveal principles that will shape law and politics for decades. The Supreme Court's rejection of Trump's emergency legal appeals apparently addresses multiple issues that Trump has been raising across his various cases. Trump has argued that former presidents should have immunity from prosecution for official acts. The court has now definitively said no. While sitting presidents may have temporary immunity from prosecution while in office, that immunity doesn't extend to former presidents for acts they committed while in office. Once you leave office, you can be prosecuted like anyone else if you committed crimes. This ruling eliminates Trump's primary defense strategy across multiple criminal cases. He can't argue anymore that the prosecution itself is unconstitutional because former presidents can't be prosecuted. That argument is dead. The court's imposition of severe limits on unilateral presidential authority builds on the tariff ruling but establishes broader principles. The opinion discusses how emergency powers have been abused by multiple presidents, how the proliferation of emergency declarations has undermined congressional authority, and how this trend threatens the separation of powers that's fundamental to constitutional democracy. The court is drawing on both constitutional text, which gives specific powers to Congress, and on constitutional structure, which requires balance between branches. The result is a framework where presidents can still respond to genuine emergencies, but can't use emergency declarations as general purpose authority to bypass Congress on non-emergency matters. The specific areas where the court says presidential action must run through Congress include trade policy, immigration enforcement, spending priorities, and election administration. All of these are areas where presidents have been acting increasingly unilaterally through executive orders and emergency declarations. The court is now saying that major policy changes in these areas require legislation. Presidents can still execute laws and can still take actions within clear statutory authority, but they can't make up new policies or dramatically change existing policies without congressional approval. This represents a significant constraint on executive power that will affect all future presidents. The blocking of GOP redistricting schemes across multiple states creates a new legal landscape for how redistricting can be done. Federal courts are applying standards from the Voting Rights Act, from constitutional equal protection principles, and from partisan gerrymandering precedents to strike down the most extreme gerrymanders. The specific legal violations courts are finding include racial gerrymandering that dilutes minority voting power, partisan gerrymandering so extreme that it violates equal protection by essentially predetermining election outcomes, and violations of state constitutional provisions that require compact and contiguous districts. These aren't minor technical violations. These are fundamental failures to provide fair representation. The Texas redistricting case that's been blocked is particularly significant because Texas is a large state where population growth has been driven primarily by Latino voters. Yet, the Republican-drawn maps didn't create proportional Latino representation. Instead, the maps packed Latino voters into a few districts or cracked them across many districts to minimize their overall impact. Courts found this violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits voting practices that discriminate based on race. The remedy is that Texas has to redraw maps with court supervision to ensure fair Latino representation. That will likely result in several additional Latino majority districts, which will likely elect more Democrats since Latino voters lean Democratic. Similar redistricting blocks in other states create a cumulative effect where Republicans lose structural advantages across dozens of districts nationwide. When you add up all the states where courts have blocked or are likely to block aggressive Republican gerrymanders, you're talking about potentially 20 to 40 House seats that shift from safely Republican to competitive or leaning Democratic in a closely divided House. That's the difference between Republicans maintaining a comfortable majority and Democrats having a realistic path to retaking control. That's why these redistricting decisions are creating such panic among Republican strategists. The collapse of Trump's delay tactics is particularly significant because Trump has been masterful at using procedural delays to push off accountability. File interlocutory appeals to delay trials. Claim privilege over documents to delay disclosure. Request recusals of judges to delay proceedings. Argue about venue to delay cases moving forward. Trump has turned legal delay into an art form, using every possible procedural mechanism to push criminal trials past elections or past other political events. But the Supreme Court's ruling addresses and forecloses many of these delay tactics by establishing that they're being used in bad faith to obstruct justice rather than for legitimate legal purposes. When the Supreme Court says there are no more delays, lower courts take that as direction to move cases forward quickly and to reject further delay attempts. The specific language about ending immunity claims is important because immunity has been Trump's go-to argument in civil cases as well as criminal cases. Trump has argued he's immune from civil lawsuits related to January 6th, immune from defamation suits, immune from suits about his financial conduct. The Supreme Court's rejection of immunity claims for former presidents applies broadly across civil and criminal contexts. You can't use immunity to avoid accountability in any legal proceeding once you're out of office. That opens Trump up to liability across multiple cases where he's been claiming immunity. The opening of the door to rapid prosecution means Trump's criminal trials will likely proceed quickly. The federal cases, the Georgia case, the ongoing cases in New York, all of these can now move to trial without further major delays. That means Trump could face multiple trials in the coming months, potentially resulting in convictions before the next major election. That's the nightmare scenario for Trump and for Republicans who've been hoping trials would be delayed indefinitely or at least past the next election. Now, trials are likely to happen quickly, and convictions are possible before voters go to the polls. The potential for asset seizures is mentioned as another consequence of the delay tactics ending. If Trump is convicted of financial crimes, courts can seize assets as part of criminal penalties. If he loses civil cases, he may have to pay judgments that require liquidating assets. Trump's business empire and personal wealth could be at serious risk if multiple legal cases proceed to unfavorable conclusions without further delays. That's not just legal accountability, that's potential financial ruin for someone whose identity is tied to wealth and business success. The years of judicial slow walking that have protected Trump are now ending based on clear signals from the Supreme Court that delay tactics won't be tolerated. Lower court judges who might have been inclined to grant Trump delays or to be cautious about proceeding against a former president now have clear direction from the Supreme Court that Trump doesn't get special treatment, that delays are disfavored, and that cases should proceed efficiently. This change in judicial approach will accelerate every case Trump is involved in. The impact on other Trump allies who've been using similar legal strategies is significant. If Trump can't use immunity arguments or delay tactics, neither can his co-defendants or his associates who are facing their own legal problems. The legal framework that's protected Trump and his circle is collapsing for all of them simultaneously. That creates pressure for more cooperation as people realize they can't delay their way out of accountability and start looking for ways to minimize their own legal exposure through plea deals or cooperation agreements. The precedent these rulings set about presidential power will affect all future administrations. Democratic presidents won't be able to use broad emergency powers either. That's actually good for constitutional democracy, even if it constrains presidents whose policies you might support. The point of checks and balances is that they apply to everyone, and limits on power protect against abuses regardless of which party is in power. Future presidents will have to work with Congress more, which is how the system is supposed to work. The Supreme Court has essentially said that the post-9/11 expansion of executive authority has gone too far and that it's time to restore the balance between the branches of government. That's a significant constitutional development that will shape American governance for years to come. Now, let's talk about the political implications of these rulings because they extend far beyond the courtroom. The Republican Party is facing a crisis that cuts in multiple directions at once. On one hand, they're dealing with a presidential candidate who is increasingly seen as legally compromised and who may be convicted of crimes before the next election. On the other hand, they're dealing with an electoral map that has suddenly become much more competitive because the gerrymandering protections they relied on have been stripped away. And on a third front, they're dealing with the collapse of the legal strategies that have been protecting Trump and his allies from accountability. All of this is happening simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of political and legal problems that the party has no obvious way to navigate. The visible panic among Republican lawmakers tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they're taking these developments. Politicians don't flee the Capitol unless they believe they're facing an existential threat. The emergency strategy sessions that convened immediately after the rulings show a party that is scrambling to figure out what to do next. And the frantic phone calls and statements of protest indicate that they're still in the early stages of processing what these rulings mean for their political futures. There are no easy answers for them. The legal pathways they've been relying on are closed. The electoral advantages they've been counting on are gone. The accountability they've been avoiding is now inevitable. Trump's legal team must now defend his cases on the merits, as immunity arguments and delay tactics are dead. Trials could proceed within 6-12 months, potentially overlapping with the midterm campaign, posing serious political risks for Republicans, especially on newly fairer electoral maps. In the past, Republicans could count on gerrymandering to protect vulnerable members and to maintain House control even when losing the national popular vote. Now, they have to actually compete for votes in legitimately competitive districts. That requires better candidates, better messaging, and the ability to appeal to moderates and swing voters rather than just turning out the base. Many current Republican members aren't equipped for that kind of campaign because they've only had to win primaries in safe districts. They don't know how to run competitive general election campaigns. The Democratic opportunity has expanded significantly because of the redistricting decisions. Democrats now have a realistic path to retaking the House majority if they can win most of the newly competitive seats. That would give them control of the House, which means control of the legislative agenda and control of investigative committees. Democratic control of the House would intensify oversight of Trump and of Republican misconduct. It would also enable Democrats to pass legislation that's been stalled. The political implications of House control changing are enormous. The Republican Civil War will intensify because the party now faces both legal crisis with Trump and electoral crisis from redistricting. Different factions will blame each other for the mess. MAGA members will blame establishment Republicans for not fighting hard enough. Establishment will blame MAGA for tying the party to Trump's criminality. Moderates will blame extremists for making the party unelectable. This circular firing squad will continue through the election cycle and will damage Republican prospects as internal fighting dominates coverage instead of positive messaging. Trump's fundraising might suffer as major donors reassess whether supporting him makes sense when he's facing imminent trials without viable defenses. Money is practical. Donors want to support winners and viable candidates. If Trump looks like he's heading toward convictions, some donors will redirect money toward other candidates or causes. That financial pressure could weaken Trump's operation and could strengthen potential primary challengers if any emerge. The Supreme Court's institutional position is strengthened by these rulings because they're applying law fairly, even when it hurts the party that appointed most of the justices. Conservative justices ruling against Trump on constitutional principles demonstrates judicial independence. That's important for public trust in courts. If the court had bent law to protect Trump, it would have destroyed credibility. By ruling based on law instead of partisan preference, the court maintains legitimacy even in highly politicized cases. For Congress, these rulings restore authority and create opportunity for legislative action. If presidents can't act unilaterally on major issues, then Congress has to legislate. That means Congress becomes more relevant and more powerful. But it also means Congress has to actually function and pass laws, which is difficult given polarization and dysfunction. Whether Congress can rise to the challenge of restored authority remains to be seen. The international implications matter because America's allies and adversaries are watching. Democratic allies want to see American institutions work and will be encouraged by courts constraining executive overreach and ensuring fair elections. Authoritarian adversaries who've been pointing to American dysfunction as evidence democracy doesn't work will be disappointed by these rulings showing democratic institutions can self-correct. America's global standing depends partly on whether it can maintain democratic norms domestically. For American democracy broadly, these rulings represent course correction. After years of concerning trends toward executive dominance and electoral manipulation, the system is showing it can push back against authoritarian tendencies through judicial enforcement of constitutional limits. That's encouraging for anyone who cares about democratic sustainability. But the rulings also reveal how close the system came to breakdown. If the court had ruled differently, if gerrymandering had been allowed to continue unchecked, if presidents had been allowed unlimited emergency powers, we'd be in much more serious democratic crisis. The precedent about emergency powers will affect how future crises are handled. Genuine emergencies still require quick executive action, but the court has now established that emergency declarations have to be for actual emergencies, not just policy priorities that Congress won't approve. That's the right constitutional balance, but it means responses to future genuine emergencies might be complicated by fights over whether presidents' actions are justified. Finding the balance between enabling necessary emergency action and preventing abuse of emergency powers is an ongoing challenge. Now, let's consider the broader implications of these rulings for the future of American democracy. The Supreme Court has essentially affirmed that the constitutional system of checks and balances is still functional. The executive branch is not all-powerful. Congress has a role to play. Courts can enforce limits, elections need to be fair. This is a significant affirmation of democratic norms at a time when many people were questioning whether those norms still held. The panic we're seeing among Trump allies is the response of people who believed they had found a way around those norms, who thought they could consolidate power through legal maneuvers and electoral manipulation, and who are now discovering that the system is pushing back. That's a hopeful sign for anyone who believes in democratic governance. The Supreme Court rulings stripping Trump of immunity and blocking Republican gerrymandering mark a watershed moment, ending an era of executive dominance and electoral manipulation. While necessary, the fact that such rulings were needed at all is a sign of how far the system had drifted. Accountability is now being enforced, but the transition will be tumultuous and the system will be tested.